As we head into the midterm election season, one issue that has risen to the top of voter concerns is a general feeling these days that the social order is breaking down, that there are no more safe spaces anywhere. Street crime, home invasions, carjacking, porch pirates, medical staff attacked at hospitals, incivility at sports arenas. And I think the Grubhub driver is eating my French fries.
Good morning, it's Friday, Aristotle Friday, October the 6th, and this is The True Conservative. Welcome to all the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there. I'm Ron, your host, and the only true conservative in the United States today. So today, after the Serenity prayer and the patriotic song of the day, we will have my take, McCarthy, Ayn Rand quote, rules for patriots, rules for retrogrades, the rape of the mind, no free lunch, bishop-barron, and Aristotle. Complicated thought made easy. All that and more when I get back. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. Amen. Thank you. And now there's no free lunch. 250 Economic Truths by David-Bahnsen.
As government regulates business more, that favors corporations large enough to have substantial legal and compliance departments. Regulation serves as a kind of fixed cost to doing business, discouraging market entry. Not only do higher rates of regulatory growth correlate with increases in market concentration ratios, but the period during which regulation increased significantly, 1990 to 2000, was followed by increases in market concentration. None of those correlations prove causality, but at the very least it is possible that government regulation is a major force behind the rise of market power. Tyler Cowen. Regulation is a subsidy. There is no more cronyist tool in human history than that of regulation. It favors the already big and discourages, if not pulverizes, the aspirational.
And that was There's No Free Lunch by David-Bahnsen. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, the rape of the mind.
The administrative mind. Administrators today cannot handle their jobs adequately within the limits of the simple knowledge of people and nations that served governments in former years. If our leaders cannot take into account the irrational forces in themselves and in other men and nations, they may easily be swept off into the maelstrom of mass emotions. If they cannot learn to recognize that their private or official conduct often reflects their prejudices and irrationalities, they will not be able to cope with the often unexpected prejudices of others. If they are, for instance, not sensitive to the paradoxical strategy hidden behind the misleading Aesopian language of totalitarian, they will not be able to counter the Cold War. Psychological knowledge has become a must in our era of confused human relations. Do our people in office, for instance, understand fully the provocative totalitarian strategy of slandering and wild accusation? And are they able to handle it adequately? Do they realize that the mere official denial never has as strong an appeal and impact as initial accusation, and in fact usually fits into the accuser's strategy? Apparently they do not, for many still use simple official denial as a defense against the totalitarian strategy of accusation, when in fact only repeated exposure and ridicule of the very root of this technique can defeat it. Do they realize the implications of the strategy of raising sham problems? The totalitarian and the demagogue often use this confusing technique by launching emotional inquiries and investigations and asking for attention for quasi-problems. They seek to divert attention from their real aims. Do they understand, for instance, what lies behind the technique of exploiting the chivalry and generosity of the public and blackmailing the pity of the world? The strategy of complaining and calling for justice is a well-known mental defense used by neurotic individuals to arouse guilt feelings in others and to cover up their own hidden aggressiveness. The exploitation of pity and the overt declaration of one's own purity and honest innocence is a familiar trick when it is used by individuals, but we are less likely to recognize it when it is used in international politics. Do our administrators realize that even the romantic ideals of brotherly love and world peace can be used to cover up aggressive designs? After the First World War, we heard many inspiring, idealistic catchwords from the defeated Central European countries. Their press and their leaders described in great detail, for all the world to know, the inner purification through suffering of the defeated peoples. Thus, these countries appealed to the conscience and compassion of the whole world, but it was a questionable conversion. Every therapist knows that those who talk a great deal about their inner change and recovery have, for the most part, not changed at all. The fine phrases are so often contradicted by actions. Politicians must recognize that this can be as true for nations as it is for individuals. Let us not forget that nations don't talk. Official words are made up by representatives with unofficial and mostly unknown inner motivations. Administrators, diplomats, and politicians from the nerve centers and paths of communication between peoples and nations, the tensions in the diplomatic regions represent the political tensions in the world, but they represent other things too. The political profession is subject to special kinds of nervous tensions. The moment the administrator arrives at a top level, an inner change may take place. From then on, he can identify with those who formerly led him. The very fact of being in office and being a leader may change a man's mind in many ways. Often he removes himself more and more from human problems and from the people he represents, and thinks only in terms of national strategy, official ideology, and the aims of power politics. Or childhood ambitions, long frustrated, are aroused. He may become the victim of his inflated personal ambitions and his individual notion of responsibility, and as a consequence, lose control of his own personality. Leading statesmen, burdened by responsibilities, have to become more careful. Indeed, they often have to express themselves in non-committal language. Yet they are not aware that such language gradually may reform their way of thinking. Finally, they may think they possess a priority on double talk. Another difficulty is related to a rather general fear of success. Once a high ambition is reached, a long-hidden fear from childhood may awake. A fear related to an early competition with the father and with the siblings. From this time on, the envy and hostility of those bypassed may start to injure the statesman's life. The danger of assuming any leadership, even of any form of self-assertion, is that it provokes resistance and hostility, retaliation and punishment. The administrator knows himself to be in the public eye. He feels exposed to criticism and political attack. If he didn't have it before, from now on, he has to develop a defensive facade in order to court the public and the voters. The result may be that the former meek Democrat, the believer in government by the people, suddenly takes on the stature of an authoritarian personality. He is guided by his frustrated infantile fantasy of leadership. The administrative brain trusters, with all their inner problems, nevertheless make history for us. Our minds are deeply affected by their minds. At the same time, we, the great public, influence them, and our civilized impulses may direct them to find the good road, just as our primitive drives and influences may urge them on to push us all into catastrophe. The intrusion of the administrative mind becomes even more precarious when the authorities in power follow patterns of procedure not controlled by court and the law. In such cases, prejudice and arbitrariness can easily develop, as we have experienced with many of our security regulations. Official secrecy is a token of magic power. The more hush-hush there is in the world, the less democratic control and the greater the fear of treachery. It should be technically quite simple to administer any group or nation, or even the whole world. Mankind certainly knows enough to do this job. We know a great deal about history, sociology, and science of human relations and government, at least enough not to repeat the mistakes from history. We live in a world of technical and economic abundance, but we have not yet learned to apply what we know or to organize the resources of the world. Somewhere, something has gone wrong, and things have gotten out of hand. The will of nations and people to understand one another seems to be paralyzed, and mutual fear and suspicion have been built up by the fantasies of mythical ideologies warring against one another. And tomorrow, only the tales of the fighting dogs may remain. During the Second World War, I was sent as an official representative of the Netherlands government to an international meeting on welfare and war relief. Here I became even more aware of the extent to which private passions can mold the way we handle public problems. All of us at the conference had cold, expressionless faces, which implied a sharp, unbiased form of thinking, but our unconscious minds were touched by other problems. Welfare is often much more a subject of hate than of love and sympathy. One's pride and prestige can play a much greater role than pity for the poor victim. The displaced persons and the people of the devastated and underdeveloped countries are very much aware of this fact. They do not like the role in which fate has cast them. They have to play the double role of the eternal victim, who is not only the victim of politics and war, but also of the often arrogant provider of charity. As a matter of fact, the representative at the receiving end of the deal resented any offer made to his country. Everybody wants to be himself the generous uncle from America. The ailment.
And that was The Rape of the Mind by Joost-meerlo, M.D. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, rules for retrogrades. 40 tactics to defeat the radical left.
Rule 30. The retrograde must be tough-fibered but chaste. Accordingly, his watchword should be coarse but never crass. As will be understood below, he must have thick skin and a weak stomach. Unadorned language representing rugged, time-proven ideas, one of these being sexual purity, is one of the most desperately needed paradoxes in the defense of civil society. Tough, non-backpedaling, unapologetic language is one of the retrograde's handiest tools against the statecraft and psyops of the radicals. Here's why. The radicals' unsung, implied anthem, thick skin, strong stomach, forms the perfect opposite to the retrogrades, and it provokes the strangest 1-2 punch imaginable. The radical scandalizes the young with brazen sexual lewdness that pulls further and ever further underwater the flagging morality of our culture. That part of the story is well told, but surprisingly frequently, the radical downshifts into shrill prude mode and churlishly wags his finger in the faces of the decent, should they presume to use a plastic straw or a cigarette in his presence. All human beings have an inbuilt drive for morality. Radicals act thin-skinned in order to virtue signal their perverse, anti-natural law pseudo-morality, which is truly an anti-morality. Believe it or not, the profile of the American radical turns out to be one-half libertine eco-terrorist and one-half pearl-clutching parish councilwoman. It's genuinely odd to find so much Puritanism remaining in American far-leftist ideology. It's still odder how no one seems to notice. Thin skin, strong stomach proves to be the strangest symptom of modern Western civilization's half Puritan, half Enlightenment schizophrenia. It is especially prominent in post-Protestant places like America and England. At the beginning of the modern era, the radical alchemist concocted a toxic bromide titrated with one very inert, Puritanism, and one very radioactive, Enlightenment, element. These were the two elemental forces of modernity. One minute, these people are showing school kids how to put a condom on a vegetable, and the next, they're lecturing you about the dangers of trying to leave the hospital without the newest model of car seat for your newborn. They're actually crazy. These creeps switch from obscene gesturing school pervert to sighing, tisking school marm with demoralizing swiftness. But there's a method to their psyops. In fact, it's almost genius in the bewilderment caused to the opponents of the radicals. Consider Seinfeld's Elaine Bennis, who in one episode chides a smoking pregnant mother. You realize what that does to the fetus, don't you? In a later episode, Elaine dumps her pro-life boyfriend on the sole basis of his impassioned defense of fetuses. Is this veritable schizophrenia? No. The viewer discovers simply that Elaine never cared about fetal health at all, but only about the elimination of one of the preordained radical bêtes noires, smoking. Elaine's easily typified radical proposition reduces to the absurdity that it should be legal, and not at all discouraged, to intentionally slaughter fetuses, but illegal and aggressively discouraged to engage the small to moderate risk that they be somewhat harmed by ingested smoke. Or still more absurdly, Elaine has signaled to her boyfriend and all Seinfeld viewers that defending the lungs of fetuses is admirable, but defending their lives is morally unacceptable. Welcome to Clown World. Also consider singer Katy Perry, who spearheads something she calls purposeful pop, sometimes woke pop, by posturing against gun violence, hate speech, and NFL racism. Anyone who hasn't seen her perform or glanced at her lyrics might mistake her for an officious, principled, female social worker. However, she sings songs like the one called Last Friday Night, which by all appearances was written to attract the attention of 12-year-old girls. Indeed it was. The libertine re-education of America's youth through pop culture cannot come to pass unless they first possess these youth as a captive audience. In the chorus of this bizarrely puerile-sounding sonic arrangement, puerile even for Katy Perry, the sometimes moralizing, finger-wagging school marm upshifts back into school pervert, singing, "Last Friday night we went streaking in the park, skinny dipping in the dark, then had a menage a trois." Bear in mind, this lyric falls in the chorus of the song, being loudly repeated several times. Radicals, moderates, and even apathetic conservatives allow their children to listen to that filth. To put this all into context, recall how radicals and even moderates will literally bemoan, complete with loud histrionics, the use of any modifier besides the newest neologism designating the mentally retarded, while in other venues, the self-same radicals and moderates will argue vehemently, in the name of human progress, to abort all fetuses pre-diagnosed as mentally retarded. They're wicked. The radical credo is the soul of insanity and self-contradiction. Thin skin, strong stomach shows them for what they are. Combat this by showing off your thick skin and weak stomach. Remind the radicals that you will not amend your language to befit their neologistic statecraft, wherein they control thought by monitoring language. For instance, tell them, I will not be shamed into using your new term for the mentally retarded. I will, however, always defend their right to life, and moreover, to live happily free of radical politics, of depersonalization, and eugenics.
And that was Rule 30 from Rules for Retrogrades, 40 Tactics to Defeat the Radical Left by, who is it here? Timothy and David Gordon. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, Rules for Patriots. How Conservatives Can Win Again by Steve-Deace.
Hours per week. Oops. Furthermore, the typical household consuming McDonald's has an average annual income of $60,000 a year or lower. Since at least one-third of the cost of increased wages would be passed on to customers, you're not promoting a living wage, but really you're waging war on the middle class. Oops. Now, I give credit to the Huffington Post for running a thorough correction, but the truth is, this was an unnecessary hit to its credibility. All they had to do was look at what their owner does to maintain her wealth to realize they were being scammed. Final question, why do people disagree about the truth? Answer, without an agreed-upon fixed standard, everyone becomes wise in his own eyes. Everyone believes their truth, which means somebody's truth isn't true. The fixed moral standard that once served this country well and made it the freest and most prosperous nation on the planet was the Judeo-Christian moral tradition. Since we have abandoned it, the culture has become more immoral, government has grown uncontrollably, and many once treasured institutions and associations in this country have become corrupted. That pretty much settles the argument on what truth is actually true as far as I'm concerned. The question is whether or not there is enough humility remaining in this culture to admit we've deviated off the proper path and ask for directions back to the main or narrow road. Now, after listening to my answers to those questions, you get an idea of what I'm talking about. As a conservative, are you more confident arguing the premise I just articulated in my answers to those 8 questions, or the phony fairness premise of the American left? That's what I thought. All too often, we accept the premise of the left's argument on virtually every issue, which allows them to frame the political battlefield. Any good general will attempt to shape the battlefield in a manner that gives his soldiers the best chance at victory. And we should do the same in the culture war as well. Could you imagine the possibilities if we made the left defend the constitutionality, see that as legality, of all their statist schemes, and if our Republican politicians asked questions that rejected their premise from the outset? I get asked questions all the time from the left's perspective, and I never accept their premise. For example, in 2011, I did an interview on Dutch national television. One of the questions was whether those who practice homosexuality should be allowed to serve openly in the military. I believe all men and women that are physically qualified and able to conform to the uniformed code of military justice ought to be able to serve their country, I replied. But what about gays and lesbians, the Dutch host asked. I'm sorry, maybe you didn't hear me, I replied. I believe all men and women that are physically qualified and able to conform to the uniformed code of military justice ought to be able to serve their country. Now the host looked confused. So is that a yes or a no, he asked me. There are only two types of people, I told him. Men and women. He had nowhere to go after that because I totally shut his premise down by rejecting it from the outset. From there, I was on offense throughout the rest of the interview. Recently, I was asked by a newspaper reporter to comment on a story he was working on regarding the perception conservatives have a monopoly on the American flag and patriotism. The story centered around a liberal activist who was sewing into an American flag an anti-marriage, pro-immorality speech by Hillary Clinton as a protest against this perceived bias. Do you think the American flag is seen as a conservative symbol, he asked me. I answered, the American flag is a symbol of the virtues and values the generation that devised it and died for it intended it to be, which they enshrined for future generations in the Declaration of Independence and U.S. Constitution. Those virtues and values should defy labels except American. Unfortunately, as we cascade over the postmodern cliff, all such absolutes are now considered negotiable. Do you think it's appropriate to incorporate the flag into progressive liberal messages like a pro-gay marriage art project, he followed up. I think our society is better off when we conform our beliefs to the virtues and values that define the American flag rather than conforming what the flag stands for to suit our own personal whims, desires, and agendas, I answered. What's your response to the claim that conservatives have an unfair monopoly on the flag, he asked for his final question. It's clear from their own writings and actions what values and virtues our founders intended the flag to stand for. There is a God, our rights come from him, and the purpose of government is to protect those God-given rights. That's how I responded. I went on to say, that vision should transcend our current petty political labeling, and if your particular agenda doesn't reconcile with that uniquely American vision, the problem is you, not the vision. Nowhere in this dialogue did I accept the premise of the questioning, which was that the country is so divided that we have multiple interpretations of traditional Americana. Nothing could be further from the truth, for we do not get to interpret the meanings of such things when the authors themselves left such a clear record of what they meant. That is social reconstructionism, and if I accept the premise of these questions, I am accepting the validity of that pagan and un-American philosophy, which means we never arrive at the truth and just keep arguing our own perspectives. If the leftists want to make the case what they believe is in line with the founding vision of these United States, then by all means, go back into the historical record and make that case. Except they won't, because they can't. There's a simple reason why the left doesn't pay as much homage to the founding of this country as we do. And it's because most of what they believe is contrary to it, which is why they've had to take over the schools and scrub that history from the textbooks. Even one of the left's favorite founding fathers, Thomas Jefferson, was so conservative compared to most liberals, they'd peg him with their favorite word for conservatives nowadays, extreme. Proving yet again that whichever side's premise is argued in the argument always wins was McCain-Palin in 2008. During each of the debates that year, including the vice presidential showdown between Sarah Palin and Joe Biden, the Democrats argued the economic collapse happening at the time was the result of too much deregulation, when the exact opposite was true. Not once in any of these debates did McCain-Palin defend the free market, and they just accepted the premise of the Democrats' phony arguments. An economic crash from too much big government resulting in President Bush insanely saying, "I'll suspend free market principles to save the free market," was the perfect time for the Republican presidential ticket to take the national witness stand on behalf of free enterprise. It gave McCain-Palin a chance to triangulate between the unpopular Democrat Congress and the unpopular lame duck President Bush and channel the angst of Joe the plumber as our champions to take on the ruling class. Instead, the premise of Obama-Biden that government wasn't tinkering with our economy enough was allowed to stand. In the minds of voters, an attack unanswered or a premise unchallenged becomes true. So the American people took their cue from that and voted for more big government by voting for Obama-Biden. And they've been suffering for it ever since. Proving those who do not learn from history are doomed to repeat it. Not once but twice during the 2012 presidential debates, Mitt Romney failed to confront President Obama on his version of the events that led to 4 dead Americans at the Benghazi terrorist attacks. Romney allowed Obama's false premise to be asserted on the biggest stage of the campaign, thus allowing what should have been an issue that toppled the Obama presidency to become a strength prior to voters heading to the polls. It wasn't until after the election and congressional hearings featuring several Benghazi whistleblowers, all of whom worked for Obama, that the president's account proved to be false. By then, though, it was too late, and those 4 dead Americans and their families still have yet to receive justice as of the time this book was written. One of the reasons we see so many Republicans accepting the premise of the left's argument is because they don't possess a solid worldview. Thus, most Republicans end up being defined by what they're against and not what they're for. Without a premise, they're just playing defense and often end up opposing things like homosexuals marrying because it's icky, not because they have any principled basis for doing so. Once the left exposes that, they cave on a moral issue like marriage because they can be exposed as hypocrites for their own private sexual behavior. Heck, most Republicans don't know what they're for beyond their forbidding Democrats. The left is always advancing its premise, and too many Republicans don't have one, which means unless we the people step in, we end up allowing liberals to frame the argument. We can step in when it comes to voting, but at some point we need to actually elect politicians who can advance our premise in the arena of public policy. Otherwise, we'll continue going forward over the cliff the left has us headed towards. The only debate will be how fast over that cliff we go.
Thank you. And that was Steve-Deace, Rules for Patriots, How Conservatives Can Win Again. And one of the things that you need to be aware of with Steve-Deace is he's talking about politicians. When he says conservatives, he's not talking about rank and file conservatives. For instance, he's talked about having a premise about gay marriage. And so that if you get asked about gay marriage, blah, 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 if I, as a rank-and-file conservative, am asked about gay marriage, it's nobody's business. I can and do feel free to say, I'm sorry, it's none of your business. Right? Steve-Deace was being interviewed. Well, do you think that there should be gay marriage? He could have said, since he's not running for office, right, he could have said, none of your business, and leave it at that. Okay, so what he's talking about, where you have to have your premises and all these things he's talking about, are dealing with office holders and other conservatives that are in the public eye. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, Bishop Robert Barron.
There is no guru, teacher, founder, nobody who's as strange and relentless as Jesus. And therefore, the religion attached to Jesus is the strangest of them all. Jesus says, whoever loves father or mother more than me, son or daughter more than me, is not worthy of me. The Buddha would not say this. Muhammad wouldn't say this. Moses wouldn't say this. Confucius wouldn't say this. Aristotle wouldn't say it. Plato wouldn't say it. I don't know anybody in the philosophical or religious tradition who would say such a strange thing. But Jesus says it. Your love for me personally has to go beyond the most intense loves of your life. Now, you see the point I'm making, everybody, and why I speak of the strangeness of Christianity. He wouldn't say this unless he himself in person were the very highest good.
And that was Bishop Robert Barron. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, Ayn Rand quote of the day. Quote, the only proper moral purpose of a government is to protect man's rights, which means to protect him from physical violence, to protect his right to his own life, to his own liberty, to his own property, and to the pursuit of his own happiness. Without property rights, no other rights are possible. Unquote. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, Stuart-Varney's My Take.
Britain's Prime Minister has jumped right into the transgender debate. Rishi Sunak said this. Roll it.
Also should be controversial for parents to know what their children are being taught in school. A man is a man and a woman is a woman. That's just common sense.
Whoa, did you hear that? He went further, actually. He said we shouldn't be bullied into believing that people can be any sex they want to be. They can't. That's his words. The Prime Minister has made his opinion clear. That's refreshing, because trans activists want to shut the debate down. To them, free speech is dangerous. India Willoughby is a well-known trans journalist in Britain. She said the Prime Minister is putting people in danger and inciting threats to their lives. Her words. That's a consistent theme. You're dangerous if you say a man is a man, a woman is a woman. Keep quiet. You're putting lives at risk. Really? Remember Senator Josh Hawley asking a Berkeley professor, no less, if a biological male can have a baby. The professor said just asking that question was inciting violence. What? That doesn't add to the debate. It shuts it down. What Rishi Sunak did was very important. He said what you are not supposed to say. He broke the trans taboo. It's called free speech. Can you see President Biden saying a man is a man and a woman is a woman? Probably not. Second hour of Varney just getting started.
And that was Stuart-Varney's My Take. Back in a minute. Thank you. Another thing I just thought about in terms of McCarthy. Every time somebody was asked, and the Republican caucus about McCarthy getting the axe, not one of them said, oh, he was right. McCarthy was right to do what he did. Not one. All they would say is, well, he was my friend, or he is my friend, or we've been friends for 15 years, or I've known him since the time I came into Congress, or whatever. Who cares? I think it's a very telling thing that nobody will support nobody will support him, McCarthy. And there's a lot of talk about how all the other Republicans voted for him because they could afford to. They could afford to. Everybody knew, because I think the Democrats made it obvious, that all the Democrats were going to vote to oust him. So they knew that all they needed was 5, 6, 7 extra votes. So you hang around and you wait. See what's going to happen when you see the 5, 6, 7, 8 votes come up on the Republican side to oust him, to put it over the top. Then everybody else gets to vote no. And then they get to, I guess, be a hero or whatever. So, but anyways, the main point I'm trying to make here is nobody defended McCarthy and said that what he did was right. Nobody said he was a good speaker. Nobody said that he was an excellent leader. Obviously, he wasn't. But nobody said any of those things. All they would say is, he was my friend. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, Aristotle for everybody.
Part 4. Man the Knower. Chapter 16. What goes into the mind and what comes out of it? Earlier chapters have dealt with thinking and with knowing, but not with the mind that thinks and knows. In Part 2, we consider productive thinking, the kind of thinking that is involved in the making of things. There we also considered the kind of knowledge needed for making, the kind we called skill or know-how. In Part 3, we examined practical thinking and practical knowledge, thinking about the means and ends of human action, and knowledge of what is good and bad for us to seek, or right and wrong for us to do in the conduct of our lives. Now, in Part 4, we will be concerned with theoretical thinking, thinking for the sake of knowing, not just for the sake of production or action. And we will be concerned with knowledge itself, with knowledge of the way things are, as well as with knowledge of what we ought or ought not to do. Here, for the first time, we will consider what we know about the mind that thinks and knows. Language plays a large part in human thinking and knowing. The words we use, according to Aristotle, express the ideas we think with. The declarative sentences we utter or the statements we make express opinions that we affirm or deny, opinions that may be either true or false. When a statement we make happens to be true, it expresses knowledge. If it happens to be false, we've made an error. We cannot be in error about something and have knowledge about it at the same time. Opinions may be either true or false, correct or erroneous, but incorrect, erroneous, or false knowledge is as impossible as a round square. Where do the ideas with which we think come from? It seemed obvious to Aristotle that we are not born with them in our minds, that they are somehow the products of our experience. That is why his account of human thinking and knowing turns first to the senses and to the experience that results from the functioning of our senses. The senses are the windows or doorways of the mind. Whatever comes into the mind from the outside world comes into it through the senses. What comes into it may be words or sentences that other human beings utter. As everyone knows, we learn a great deal that way, certainly from the moment that our schooling begins. But learning does not begin with schooling, nor does all our learning, even after schooling, involve statements made by others. Taking the human race as a whole, as well as human infants in every generation, learning begins with sense experience before the learners use words to express what they have learned. In Aristotle's day, it was generally thought that we have 5 external senses: sight, hearing, touch, smell, and taste. The reason Aristotle called them external senses is that each involves a sense organ on the surface of our bodies, there to be acted on by the outside world. Sight results from the action on our eyes of things outside us, hearing from what outside acts on our ears, touch from what outside acts on our skin, smell from what outside acts on our nose, and taste from what outside acts on our tongue and mouth. Modern scientific research has discovered that we have more than 5 senses and sense organs. For example, the sense organs by which we sense hunger and thirst within our own bodies, and the sense organs by which we sense the motion of our limbs or the position of our bodies. But the exact number of senses and sense organs does not affect the account that Aristotle gives of the contribution that the senses and sense experience make to our thinking and knowing. Each of the senses produces sensations only when its sense organ is acted on physically by something in the outside world. The senses are passive receivers that must be activated from the outside. Each of our sense organs is a highly specialized receiver. We cannot taste or smell things with our eyes. We cannot hear or see them with our tongues and noses. We are aware of colors through our eyes, of sounds through our ears, of odors through our nose, and so on. Certain aspects of the world around us we can be aware of in more than one way. The size and shape of bodies we can see as well as feel by touch. We can see and hear the motion of bodies from one place to another, and we can even tell whether that motion is slow or fast. Sensations of the various kinds just mentioned are the raw materials out of which our sense experience is formed. Though these raw materials come in separately from outside, through the channels of different sense organs, they do not remain separate or isolated from one another in our sense experience. The world we experience through our senses is a world of bodies of various sizes and shapes, in motion or at rest, and related to one another in space in a variety of ways. Our experience of this world of bodies also includes a wide variety of qualities: the colors bodies have, the sounds they make, the roughness or the smoothness of their surface, and so on. According to Aristotle, our sense experience is the product of perception on our part. The sensations we receive passively through our sense organs are merely the raw materials that we somehow put together to constitute the seamless fabric of our sense experience. In that putting together, we are more active than passive. Sensation is input from the outside, but the sense experience that arises from our perception of that outside world involves memory and imagination on our part. It is composed of many elements, all having their origin in what our various senses take in, but transformed by the way they are put together to make up the whole that is the world we perceive. If we describe any typical perceptual experience in words, we see at once that there is much more to it than the raw materials of sensation. For example, you perceive a big, black, barking dog chasing a tiger-striped yellow cat down the street, and the cat runs in front of a blue automobile that screeches to a sudden halt. In that description of a sense experience, only a few words name visible or audible qualities sensed by the eye and the ear, the colors and the sounds. a dog and a cat, an automobile in the street, chasing, running, and suddenly slowing down to a halt, all these things that you perceive involve more than sensations received from outside. When you perceive an object that you call a dog or a cat, or when you perceive actions that you call chasing or running, your memory and your imagination are involved, especially if the dog you perceive is a stranger to you, while the cat is a familiar animal that you have seen around before. In addition, your understanding is involved. You have some understanding of the kind of animal that a cat is, different in kind from dogs. You have some understanding of what tigers are like, as indicated by your perception of the cat as tiger-striped. You understand the difference between walking and running, between going fast and slowing down. If you did not understand all these things, you could not have had the perceptual experience that was described. According to Aristotle, these various understandings that we have result from the activity of our mind, not from the activity of our senses. Our mind forms ideas of cats and dogs, of running and chasing. Ideas are based on the information that our senses receive from the outside world, but the ideas themselves are not received from the outside world. They are, according to Aristotle, the product of the mind's activity in its effort to understand the world we experience through our senses. Just as we can sense things because they are capable of being sensed, so we can understand things because they are understandable. If the barking dog and the screeching car were not visible and audible, we could not see and hear them. Similarly, if the dog and the cat were not understandable as different kinds of things, we could not understand them as having different natures. In Aristotle's view, we apprehend the natures of cats or dogs by our idea or understanding of what a cat is or what a dog is, just as we apprehend the blackness of the dog or the blueness of the automobile by the visual sensations received by our eyes. When a carpenter sets out to make a chair, he must have in mind an idea of the chair he wants to make. He must not only have an idea of chairs in general, but also the more definite idea of the particular chair he wishes to make. Working with these ideas and with pieces of wood as his raw material, the carpenter shapes those pieces of wood and puts them together so that they take on the form of a chair. The idea in the mind of the productive worker has become the form of the material he works on. Living matter having a certain form is a cat. Living matter having a different form is a dog. When children learn to distinguish between cats and dogs and to recognize each when they see it, their perception of cats and dogs involves some understanding of the special nature of each of these two kinds of animals. That understanding consists in their having an idea of what a cat is and an idea of what a dog is. In Aristotle's view, having the idea of a cat amounts to having in one's mind the form that is common to all cats and makes each cat the kind of animal it is. This leads him to say that just as the hand is the tool of tools, the instrument by which we use other instruments, so the mind is the form of forms. Another way of saying the same thing describes the mind as the place where the forms that are in things become our ideas of them. The mind forms ideas by taking the forms of things and separating them from the matter of things. Producing ideas is the very opposite of producing things. In producing things, we put the ideas that we have in our minds into things by transforming matter in accordance with our ideas. In producing ideas, our minds take the forms out of things and turn them into ideas, whereby we understand the nature of the things that have this or that form. Getting or producing ideas should also be contrasted with eating things. When we eat an apple, we take both its form and its matter into our bodies. The form without the matter would not nourish us. The matter without the form would not be an apple. But when we get the idea of an apple, we take the form away from the matter of the apple. The action of our mind in doing so turns the form of an apple into an idea of the kind of fruit an apple is. The ideas or understandings so far mentioned are ideas or understandings of objects that we perceive. They are the kind of objects that are present in our sense experience. They're also the kind of objects we can remember when they're absent. They're even the kind of objects that we can imagine, as we might imagine a cat or dog that we have never perceived, or dream of one that is strangely shaped or colored. But when the mind starts producing ideas on the basis of sense experience, it does not stop with ideas that enable us to understand objects we can perceive, remember, and imagine. We can understand many objects of thought that we cannot perceive, such as good and bad, right and wrong, freedom and justice. We could not have discussed these objects in earlier chapters of this book if we did not understand them, if we had not formed ideas of them. Thinking begins with the formation of ideas on the basis of the information received by our senses. Sensations are the input the mind receives from the outside world. Ideas are the output the mind produces as a result of what it receives. Thinking goes further. It relates the ideas it produces. It joins them together, separates them, and sets one idea against another. By these further activities of thinking, the mind produces knowledge. Not only knowledge about objects we can perceive, remember, or imagine, but also knowledge of objects that do not fall within our sense experience. Arithmetic, algebra, and geometry are good examples of such knowledge. A sensation is neither true nor false. You simply have it, as when you sense the blackness of a dog or the blueness of an automobile. Even when your senses deceive you, as they often do, the sensation itself is neither true nor false. The dog, for example, may have been in shadows. In bright sunlight, it would have been seen by you as grey, not black. Your sensing it as black when it is in shadows is not false. But if, on the basis of that information alone, you think that it is black, you may be in error. The error is in your thinking, not in your sensing. Every common noun and almost every adjective and verb in our language names an object of thought, an object we can think about because we've formed an idea of it. Not all the objects we can think about are objects we can also perceive, remember, or imagine. Dogs and cats, for example, are objects that we can perceive, but we can also think about them when there are no dogs and cats around for us to perceive through our senses. In addition, we can think about the very small particles of matter inside the atom, although our senses are unable to perceive anything so small, even with the help of the most powerful microscope. Like sensations, ideas are neither true nor false. If you and I were talking to one another, and I spoke the single word dog or the single word cat, you would not be able to respond by saying either yes or no. Let us assume for the moment that you and I had the same understanding of these words. What they meant for me, they also meant for you, because for each of us, they expressed the same ideas. When I said dog, you and I thought about the same object. So, too, when I said cat. Now, suppose that when I said cat, I nodded or pointed in the direction of an animal in the room that started to bark at that very moment. You would immediately say, no, that's not a cat, that's a dog. My uttering the word cat while nodding or pointing to an animal that both of us were perceiving could have been spelled out in a sentence. That animal over there is a cat. Your saying no could also have been spelled out by saying, if you think that animal is a cat, you are in error. That statement you have just made is false. We cannot be in error just thinking of cats or dogs any more than we can be in error when we see the dog standing in the shadows as black rather than grey. Only when we make some assertion, such as, that dog is black, does the question arise whether what we say or think is true or false. That word is must enter into our thinking, and along with it goes another word, not. When is and is not enter into our thinking, we have passed from the level of just having ideas to the level of combining and separating them. Then we have reached the level where we are forming opinions that can be either true or false. There are other words such as and, if, and then, since, and therefore, either, or, not both, that enter our thinking at a still higher level of thought. This is the level at which making one statement leads us to affirm another or to reject another as false. Aristotle distinguishes among these three levels of thought in his account of how the mind operates to produce knowledge. From the raw materials of sense experience, the mind forms ideas. Ideas, in turn, are the raw materials out of which the mind forms judgments, in which something is affirmed or denied. As single ideas are expressed in speech by single words or phrases, so judgments are expressed by sentences, declarative sentences in which the words is or is not occur. The third level Aristotle calls reasoning or inference. Only when one statement becomes the basis for asserting or denying another statement does the mind move up to the third level of thought. At this level, thinking involves giving reasons for what we think. At this level, what we think may not only be either true or false, it may also be either logical or illogical. Aristotle was a great logician. He founded the science of logic. He wrote the first book on the subject, a book that was the standard textbook for many centuries and that still exerts considerable influence. In the next chapter, we shall consider some of his basic rules for conducting our thinking in a logical manner. Although logical thinking is better than illogical thinking, it does not always reach conclusions that are true. Aristotle pointed out that it is possible for the mind to hold opinions that are true without reaching them in a logical manner, even as it is possible for logical thinking to result in false conclusions. Hence, after we pay some attention to what makes thinking logical or illogical, we shall have to consider what makes thinking true or false.
And that was Chapter 17 from Aristotle for Everybody, Difficult Thought Made Easy by Mortimer J. Adler. Back in a minute. Thank you. This is Ron, your host, the only true conservative in the United States. Today, bidding adios to all the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there, and reminding you to be honest, smart, and beautiful, and remember that the left has no authority, no power, and they can't win.